Remember when I told you right back at the start of this series that I bought this little painting without knowing anything about Vermeer? Well, it turns out that that wasn't entirely true. There was something that I knew but I'd forgotten. All I need to show you is a wine glass and some sunshine. But before that, I'd just like to take a look at some of the early paintings in the first years of his professional career. In 1655, Vermeer was 22. He didn't turn 23 until October of that year. Why that year is interesting is that you'll recall that 1655 is the date that appears hidden on this little painting that I bought at auction. It's within the M-shaped mark of the word that looks like the name Meer. Vermeer at 22 was already halfway through his short life. Death finally caught up to him at the age of 43 in 1675. He was married at 20, had had his first child and been admitted to the Artists' Guild at 21 and was making a name for himself as a master painter. We know that he painted this large painting, St. Praxedis, in 1655 because it's signed and dated. Given that he didn't turn 23 until late October of that year, it's probable that he painted this as a 22-year-old. St. Praxedis has only just come out of the naughty corner of art in 2023, having now been more broadly accepted as an authentic Vermeer. But we also know that it's only a copy of a fairly obscure and slightly older Italian painting. How he came into contact with that painting is unknown, but the outcome is certainly that Vermeer was a copyist in 1655. It's thought that these other two large paintings, his first known paintings, were painted by Vermeer 1 or 2 years earlier. We also know that my auction painting is nearly identical to a much larger work depicting the same subject that was painted by Peter de Hooch. So these two old paintings are both survivors from the Dutch Golden Age, and one of them is certainly a copy. One now lives in a prestigious collection in the heart of London in the full glare of esteemed recognition, while the other one has travelled the world, slipping in and out of homes and lives, hiding in plain sight. Welcome back to Vermeer's Child, where in this episode we're going to see just how similar or different the de Hooch version of this painting is from my little painting, and maybe we'll be able to work out which one is the copy. You'll remember from the first episode that the de Hooch painting is about a third taller and a third wider than the little painting I bought at auction, which gives it twice the surface area. To make the comparison of the two paintings easier, I'll increase the size of the small painting to make them the same size so that we can just look from one to the other. While we have them at the same size, the first thing we can look at is whether one is a tracing of the other, in effect traced and then scaled up. And I'll just lay one over the top of the other, and you can see, as I go back and forth from one painting to the other, what the differences between them are. And you'll see that they are pretty much in alignment, but some of the features of one are usually just a little bit outside the boundaries of the other. So there is some displacement of the features, left or right, between the two paintings. If I speed it up a bit, you'll see it more clearly. So the first thing to look at is perspective, and to see whether both of these artists had control of perspective at the time these paintings were painted. Now, firstly, with the de Hooch painting, generally he has perspective spot on. The only thing that he doesn't have perspective under control with is his chair. It's a little bit skewed, and I guess it could be not quite square to the tiles. On the floor, it has a higher vanishing point than everything else. But notice his floor vanishing points are very clearly to one point, along with a little wall that he's drawn on the right-hand side, this little slatted fence. They all go off to pretty much a single vanishing point. And it's known that de Hooch used chalk lines to establish the framework of his paintings, so even if his was the copy, he's obviously used chalk lines to set it up, but chances are, of course, his is not the copy. Now we'll have a look at the auction painting, and you can see immediately that the floor is a bit all over the place. And it's a bit hard to see because I've indicated before that there's some overpainting, so it's a bit hard to be certain that the floor's not right, but without a doubt, the first row of floor tiles has a vanishing point that is to the right of the next lot of rows of floor tiles. And so what happens is you've got effectively two central vanishing points in the painting. There's a widening out in the foreground. The other thing that happens in the small painting, which is very clear, and it's perhaps just a facet of the fact that it's a very small painting, is that the tiles that are outside in the courtyard, in the sunlit courtyard, fade off to invisibility as they get further away. That's quite different from de Hooch, where he's been able to actually delineate every tile. Again, on the small painting, the chair has the wrong perspective again, particularly the top rail of the chair, which is only slightly above the child's eyes in terms of the vanishing point, which is somewhere just over to the left, but below all the other vanishing points. So the small painting is a bit of a dog's breakfast in terms of its vanishing points. There's no doubt about it that if it's a copy, then the copyist was pretty lazy in terms of re-establishing de Hoog's vanishing points. If it's an original, then it was done by someone who didn't have quite command of perspective. Now, one minor matter that's worth looking at is that the floor tiles on the de Hoog painting are about 7.5 rows deep from the threshold, including the threshold coming right back to the front of the picture. And there's a little bit of uncertainty in the pattern on the de Hoog painting. He seems to have missed the bottom right tile, and that could be because the painting has been added to fit into probably a larger frame, so there was a little bit of addition added to it. I don't know where that it was done, but it's possibly it was in the foreground. On the smaller painting there's an extra row of tiles, including the threshold, so it's got a slightly deeper foreground to it than de Hoog has. The thing that I find most interesting about the difference between the two paintings is the different treatment of light, and also the precision, if you like, of the de Hoog painting compared to the little auction painting. In the de Hoog painting, light and shade are depicted pretty much the way you'd see a smartphone photograph these days, where nothing is underexposed and nothing's overexposed. So it all becomes fairly even in terms of the way things are lit. I mean, sure, the courtyard's lighter than the internals of the room, but the internals of the room are also fairly light. Whereas if you have a look at the auction painting, you look at the facing wall and it's absolutely just about black. You know, it's a very dark green, but it's very, very dark, very contrasty compared to the brightness of the courtyard. And then it plunges into sort of this dark corridor, which both paintings have, by the way. And then it goes out into light again. But this difference between light and shade as you move across the painting is really marked. And it's sort of a horizontal movement of light and shade, and then it's almost a vertical movement of light and shade. I can't recall another composition that draws your eye so much just by the use of light. The two characters are framed in very bright light on the threshold, and then it goes back into darkness and back into light again. It's really clever. Now, when you look at the two people that are in the paintings, the woman that de Hoog's painted is a woman that appears in many of his paintings. It's possibly his wife. She's obviously extremely tall. You can see by the hem of her skirt's being lifted above the ground, and if she stood up she'd be gigantic. Her arms are very lengthened. Whereas if you look at the small painting, the woman actually seems wider and shorter. Now, in terms of the original alignment we did, there's not much difference between them. The de Hoog woman, you can actually see her foot sticking out the bottom, and maybe that's the key difference. But anyway, the women do appear to be quite different. When you get to the child, I assume it's a boy. In the de Hoog painting, he's carrying a basket, which apparently it's been quite uncertain over the years exactly what's in his basket. It's been called a boy bringing fruit, a boy bringing pomegranates, the boy bringing apples, and I think they've settled on a boy bringing bread or rolls. So despite being a much larger painting, they have some difficulty working out what exactly he's bringing to the woman. He seems to be very finely dressed, perhaps as a page boy. He's certainly not dressed as a street vendor, you wouldn't imagine, unless they used to dress up amazingly well. Whereas in the little auction painting, the boy is wearing more workmanlike clothes by the look of it. It's difficult to see, and we will be looking at that in detail later. But his clothes are certainly not the finery of the de Hoog painting. It's interesting that there is an alignment of the light and shade on the side of the bottom of his tunic in both paintings. So there's no doubt that one is a copy of the other. It's just that some features haven't been copied. Perhaps the triumph of de Hoog's painting is the window, the top frame of the window with the two coats of arms and the blue sky behind and the gable of the building behind. That really is probably the main feature of de Hoog's painting. And it's also the thing that actually seems to point to it being a commission for particular families, because their names are very clear on there. And perhaps the boy's bringing bread in celebration of a wedding or a joining of families or a business deal of some sort. But it certainly seems that because the names are so clear, that these must be people who actually wanted this painting. Now, my little painting, the two coats of arms don't look particularly prominent when you see them in the photograph, but they're actually quite three-dimensional when you see them in reality. But what's missing, of course, is that there's no sky and no gable. In fact, it's a completely different looking building. It's a building that must be very flat across the courtyard, going up at least 2 stories, and then perhaps with a pitched roof on top of that. So quite a different building compared to the buildings that are in the De Hoogh painting. The other major departure is the chairs. The chair in the De Hoogh painting has a cushion on it. It's got the 2 lion's head finials and the lozenges of white or gold on the back of the chair. And it's a fairly plain chair, a little bit of carving on the front of it, but not overly fancy. Pretty much the same as the chairs that appear in many of the paintings painted by De Hoogh and Vermeer. Whereas the chair in the small painting is quite different. It appears that it's got a carved frame, completely carved, and it's got an overstuffed cushion, and the finials are monumental. They're about twice the size of the finials in the De Hoogh painting. So we're going to come back and have a look at that chair in some detail, but it's significantly different from the other chair. Now, I mentioned the little dividing fence that's in the De Hoogh painting, which is a slatted fence, possibly with a timber top on it. In the little auction painting, the fence appears to be a brick fence with possibly plastered rubble on the top of it, some sort of a stucco finish on the top of it. So the 2 fences between the 2 paintings are different. I don't know why the choice is different, but I must say that the De Hoogh painting, the fence is far more prominent and maybe pushes forward a bit too much compared to the little auction painting, which is far more subtle and pushed back by the use of this broken colour. And just a minor point, the tree in the courtyard in the De Hoogh painting has a trunk that's fairly light coloured, and in the auction painting it's quite dark coloured. So that's a summary of the main visible differences between the 2 paintings. If we had have stopped looking at the small painting at this point, we would have assumed that the De Hoogh painting is finer and more detailed, and even if a little less painterly, you'd think that it's certainly the original. But this is a story that's all about the things that you can't see, the things that the artist responsible for the small painting has hidden, the things that he would have only revealed to his inner circle, perhaps his wife and children. This is a painting that conceals and misdirects. It's not even a story about a boy with a basket of apples or a woman in a doorway. The true story of what this painting's about is something that we'll unravel in a future episode. But for now I want to go back to the very start of this series, where I mentioned that the only painting of Vermeer's that I knew was Girl with a Pearl Earring. Now, it's true that that was the case, but in fact I knew that painting particularly well because we've had a photocopy of it hanging in our lounge room in a cheap plastic frame for about 20 years, and I have stopped and looked at it regularly, and once I took it out of the frame and looked at it for about an hour to study it to see whether I could teach myself how to paint portraits. What struck me about the painting was the girl's jawline in particular, which seems to be defined not by the paint but by the reflection from her collar. And not only the reflection from her collar, but I perceived also what I thought was the bounce of light from the pearl itself. Now, experts make no mention of that, so I suspect they believe it's only the collar. But I thought that as you got closer to the pearl, there appeared to be a second arc of light. So when I went along and saw the auction painting hanging very high in the room, the thing that really struck me, apart from the fact that I thought it was by Vermeer, was this arc of light sitting on the woman's cheek, and it really seemed to be glowing. Quite some time later I was sitting outside on a step having a glass of wine, and as I put it down on the step, it caught the sunlight, and I saw the same arc of light. And what it was is light passing through the glass. It wasn't the reflected light that I thought I'd seen on the girl with the pearl earrings cheek. It was light that was passing through something, so it was refracted light. And what's interesting about refracted light, particularly when it passes through an object that is slightly curved, is that it also describes a curved shape. And that shape can appear to have 3 dimensions because it quite often gets a bit of shading on one side and light on the other, but it's extremely bright in the middle. And that was what I was seeing. Now the mark on the girl's cheek is absolutely tiny. It's probably not much more than about 1/4 inch long, or 6 millimetres long. And it's been built up into quite a high impasto arc. And not only has the arc been carefully built out of paint, it's also been coloured, because it goes from sort of pinks and yellows until it gets to the very top where it's absolutely white, and then it goes down again. So the artist has not only created this shape in this tiny little area, but he's also managed to colour it the same colour as light. And it's worth also having a look at what light looks like around the rim of a glass while we're doing this, because we're going to come back to some of the other ways Vermeer depicts light, particularly where he puts these patches and dots of light along the areas of an object that are actually catching the sun. And you'll see what happens when you look at the light on the edge of the rim of a glass. You see flashes and patches and dots and circles. So that's absolutely what Vermeer obviously was looking at. So it seems that when I looked at the little painting in the auction room, maybe I did have a true premonition that it was by Vermeer, or perhaps I just remembered this mark and it had been stuck in my subconscious somewhere. But either way, it's an interesting little thing and it's worth having a good look at, and if you're ever sitting outside with a glass of wine, have a try. I'm sorry that this episode has gone on a bit longer than planned. In the next episode, it'll be a lot shorter because we're going to find another signature. And that's a very interesting episode and well worth coming back for. So I hope you'll join me then. Please subscribe if you haven't so you don't miss that episode, and also give this episode a thumbs up if you're inclined. Thanks very much for watching.